What happens when the one country you call your closest partner starts helping the nation you are trying to break? And what if that public act of help is really a private warning that your power is shrinking faster than anyone wants to admit? If you like clear stories that make world events impossible to ignore, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one friend who thinks geopolitics is boring, because this one feels like a thriller. For years, the Kremlin sold one big idea to its own people and to the world. Russia was not alone. Russia had China, not just as a trading partner, not just as a neighbor, but as a giant shield against pressure from the West. When Moscow talked tough, that confidence sat in the background like steel. Even if Europe sanctioned Russia, even if Washington armed Ukraine, even if global companies walked away, there was still Beijing. There was still the promise that the East was rising together. That belief mattered far more than many people understood. Wars are not fought only with tanks, missiles, and money. They are also fought with assumptions. Assumptions shape risks. Assumptions make leaders bold. And one of Vladimir Putin's biggest assumptions was that China would never seriously embarrass Russia while the war in Ukraine was still burning. Then came the moment that changed the mood. China openly moved to support Ukraine with humanitarian help aimed at keeping the country running through attacks on its energy system. On paper, that sounds almost technical, dry, limited, easy to ignore, but in reality, it was explosive. Because this was not just about equipment, supplies, or rebuilding damaged infrastructure. It was about symbolism. It was about timing. And most of all, it was about who China chose to be seen with and what message that sent. Think about it from Moscow's point of view. Russia spent years trying to crush Ukraine's endurance, not only on the battlefield but in daily life. Cut the power, damage the grid, exhaust the population, make ordinary people feel the war in cold apartments, dark streets, and broken services. That strategy was never just military, it was psychological. It was meant to wear down a whole society. Now imagine your so-called strategic partner stepping in and helping the other side keep the lights on. That is not a neutral gesture. That touches the logic of the war itself. And here is why this hit so hard. China did not need to do it publicly. If Beijing wanted to play both sides quietly, it had many ways to do that. It could hide behind vague statements. It could send low-profile assistance through channels that create deniability. It could stay blurry. Instead, the signal was visible, deliberate, measured, yes, but impossible to miss. China was telling the world that it could lean toward Ukraine when it wanted, and Russia would have to live with it. That single image carries a brutal message. Moscow may speak the language of partnership, but Beijing speaks the language of hierarchy, and hierarchy is all about who can act without asking permission. This is the part many people miss when they hear stories like this. They think the question is simple. Did China betray Russia, yes or no? But great powers rarely move in clean moral lines. China is not acting like a loyal friend. It is not acting like a true peacemaker either. It is acting like a state that wants options. It wants leverage over Moscow. It wants access to Europe. It wants to avoid full isolation. It wants to look constructive without giving up the benefits of Russian weakness. That is not friendship. That is management. And management is humiliating when you are the one being managed. The deeper problem for Putin is not only that China helped Ukraine, the deeper problem is that Russia has spent so much political energy pretending it had formed an unbreakable axis with Beijing. That story was useful. It reassured Russian elites. It impressed some countries in the global south. It warned Europe that sanctions could never fully isolate Moscow. It suggested that the future belonged to countries willing to challenge the West together. But if China can publicly help Ukraine while still keeping Russia economically dependent, then that story starts to rot from the inside. The myth of equal partnership fades. What remains is something colder. China has room to maneuver. Russia has less and less, because once a relationship stops looking like alliance and starts looking like dependence, every move takes on a new meaning. Every trade deal becomes leverage. Every photo becomes a signal. Every delayed payment, discount demand, or diplomatic meeting starts to feel like pressure. The war pushed Moscow deeper into China's economic orbit. After sanctions, Russia needed buyers. It needed components. It needed routes for trade. It needed banking channels. It needed markets that would still do business. China was there, but dependence never comes free. The more Russia needed China, the less freedom it had to push back. That is the trap. The partner you lean on slowly becomes the partner you cannot refuse. Look at energy. Russia sells huge volumes of oil and gas because it must keep money flowing. China buys because it wants cheap, secure supply. Those interests overlap, but they do not create equality. The side that is desperate always bargains from weakness. If Beijing can get Russian energy at better terms than others would offer, it will, not out of cruelty, out of strategy. China did not build its rise on sentiment. It built it on patience, bargaining power, and relentless advantage. That is why the Ukraine move matters beyond aid itself. It shows Beijing believes Moscow has very limited room to retaliate. Russia can complain in private. Russian commentators can grumble. But can the Kremlin truly punish China? Can it replace Chinese markets? Can it rebuild lost access to Western technology overnight? Can it afford a serious rupture while fighting a long war and managing sanctions? No. And Beijing knows that. Once one side knows you cannot walk away, the balance changes forever. This is also why European leaders watch China's moves so closely. For a long time, Europe treated the Russia-China relationship as a single dark cloud on the horizon. Not always identical interests, but close enough to be dangerous. A Russia with military aggression and a China with economic weight created a powerful image of revisionist unity. But public support for Ukraine from China, even limited support, cracks that image. It does not split the two countries apart. Not yet, but it shows the cracks already existed. And those cracks matter because Europe itself has changed. In the early years of the war, much of Europe was tense, reactive, and careful. There was fear of escalation, fear of energy shocks, fear of direct confrontation. That caution shaped policy. But over time, Europe hardened. Defense budgets rose. Old assumptions broke. Finland and Sweden moved closer to the NATO structure, with Finland joining and Sweden following. The Baltic region changed. Europe began to think less like a market and more like a security actor. That change matters to China. A fragmented Europe is easy to test. A more united Europe is more serious. If Beijing sees a stronger European mood forming against Russia, it has reasons to adjust its posture. It may not want to be chained too tightly to Moscow right when European attitudes are shifting. Helping Ukraine in a visible but limited way gives China breathing room. It can signal restraint. It can send a message that it is not identical to Russia. It can protect economic relationships that matter far beyond the battlefield. But for the Kremlin, the emotional effect is still severe. Putin built power around the image of control, control over events, control over rivals, control over Russia's status in the world. The most dangerous thing for a ruler like that is not just military difficulty, it is visible disrespect. When the world sees your closest major partner act without fear of your reaction, your aura changes. Strength starts to look like dependency in a tailored suit. And aura matters in authoritarian systems. People do not only obey because of laws or force, they obey because power feels inevitable. Once inevitability cracks, anxiety spreads upward and downward at the same time. That brings us to the central tension. Is China actually turning against Russia? Or is it doing something even more useful for itself and more painful for Moscow? The answer is the second one. China does not want Russia to win too much. A triumphant Russia could become harder to manage. It could demand more respect. It could behave with new confidence. But China also does not want Russia to collapse. A broken Russia would create chaos on China's border, threaten energy flows, and remove a strategic buffer against Western pressure. What Beijing prefers is something in between, a Russia strong enough to survive, weak enough to depend, and isolated enough to need China more every year. And if that sounds cold, it is. But cold strategy often shapes world history more than loud speeches do. When China helps Ukraine in a limited but visible way, it serves several goals at once. It softens Beijing's image abroad. It reminds Europe that China has choices. It shows Moscow who really holds the flexible position in the relationship. And it protects the deeper Chinese interest of keeping the war from producing outcomes that hurt Beijing more than they help. because long wars reshape power in ways leaders do not fully control. Russia has lost men, money, equipment, reputation, and future growth. Even if it keeps fighting, the cost accumulates. China can see that. It can do math. It can study trade flows, industrial stress, and military depletion. And it can recognize a simple fact. A Russia trapped in permanent confrontation with the West becomes easier for China to use, but also less valuable if it becomes too damaged. So Beijing is walking a narrow line. It wants influence without total responsibility. It wants access without collapse. It wants Russian dependence without Russian explosion. That is a dangerous balancing act, because history is full of powers that believe they could keep a wounded partner under control right until the moment that partner acted irrationally. Quick pause. If this story is hitting harder than you expected, save this video, subscribe, and send it to someone who still believes global powers operate on loyalty. Most of the time, they operate on need. Now let's go deeper, because the real story may be even darker than the public handshake. The biggest fear in Moscow may not be one aid package. It may be the larger pattern behind it. China has spent years increasing its reach in places Russia once treated as its own strategic backyard. In trade, logistics, technology, and the Arctic, Beijing's footprint has grown while Moscow's options have narrowed. Put those pieces together, and the story turns harsh. Russia is not just relying on China. In some areas, it may be quietly surrendering room to China. That possibility terrifies Russian nationalists because it strikes at identity, not just economics. For generations, Russia saw itself as a civilizational power, a state with its own pole in the world, too large to be subordinate to anyone. Even when Moscow cooperated with stronger economies, it still wanted strategic independence. But dependence on China changes that self-image. It suggests Russia is no longer the senior empire in the East. It suggests that survival is now purchased with discounts, silence, and strategic compromise. And once that idea takes root, even small Chinese moves begin to feel enormous. Take the Arctic question. Russia long imagined the far north as a zone where its geography gave it natural advantage. Melting ice, new shipping routes, energy potential, military access. It was one of the few spaces where Moscow believed the future could still be written on Russian terms. But if China expands commercial and logistical influence there, even as Russia is drained elsewhere, then another protected space becomes contested. Beijing does not need a flag-raising drama to gain influence. It only needs contracts, ships, financing, and timing. That is how quiet power works. It moves through systems before it appears on maps. The same logic applies to infrastructure and industry. When one state becomes the main source of critical inputs for another, it gains unseen force. It does not need to issue threats every day. The threat lives in the structure. If Russia needs Chinese components, Chinese buyers, Chinese transport solutions, and Chinese capital, then China can shape the pace and price of Russian survival. That power is less theatrical than military occupation, but in some ways, it is more durable. And this is where Putin's problem becomes personal as well as strategic. He cannot easily admit the scale of Russian dependence, because his political brand is built on restored sovereignty. He came to power promising to end weakness, end humiliation, and return Russia to respected status. But what does it say if, after years of war and confrontation, Russia ends up more dependent on Beijing than at any point in modern history? What does it say if China can sell to Russia, buy from Russia, shape Russia's options, and still reach toward Ukraine when useful? It says the Kremlin may have escaped one kind of pressure only to walk into another. These moments hit so hard because they act like mirrors. They show elites what they do not want to say aloud. And there is another layer. China's move toward Ukraine may also be a message to Washington, Brussels, and major European capitals. Do not lock us into Russia's corner. Beijing wants room. It wants to avoid a future in which every Chinese action is automatically judged as Russian alignment. A visible gesture toward Ukraine helps create that room. Even if the help is limited, even if China still benefits from ties to Moscow, the image matters. Diplomacy is partly substance, but it is also choreography. Who stands with whom? Who gets the meeting? Who receives support when cameras are on? Beijing understands choreography very well. So what does Putin do with that? In public, not much. That may be the hardest part to accept. Russia can complain privately, but open confrontation with China would expose weakness it cannot hide. If Moscow lashes out, it risks pushing Beijing further away. If it stays quiet, it confirms the imbalance. That is the trap again. Every option feels like a concession, and trapped leaders often become more dangerous, not less. This is where the broader global picture comes in. China's strategy toward Russia is shaped not only by Europe or Ukraine, but by China's own future risks. Beijing understands that a major crisis in East Asia, especially around Taiwan or the South China Sea, could bring huge pressure on Chinese trade and energy routes. In such a scenario, Russia matters. Russian oil, gas, land access, and raw materials become even more valuable. That means China does not want to destroy Russia. It wants to keep Russia alive, tied close, and available in an emergency. That explains the double game. China can help Ukraine enough to improve its image and discipline Moscow while still maintaining the relationship it may need later. From Beijing's perspective, that is rational. From Moscow's perspective, it feels like being held by the throat and the hand at the same time. And that is why the title of this story makes emotional sense, even if the deeper reality is more complex. Putin may not be freaking out because China suddenly loves Ukraine. He may be freaking out because China showed in front of the world that it can touch one of Russia's deepest pressure points and keep moving as if nothing happened. It says, "We know you need us more than we need you today." It says, "We can test the limits of your patience." It says, "Your enemy's survival can now be part of our leverage too." For a leader who built his image on making others adapt, that reversal is brutal. Some people will say this is being overread. That humanitarian help is still humanitarian help. That China has not armed Ukraine directly. That trade between Beijing and Moscow remains deep. All of that is true. This is not a clean break. But history often turns on visible signs of changing calculation. The first moment everyone sees the same imbalance. The first moment one side realizes the other has already adjusted. Because once Russia understands that China is willing to publicly help Ukraine's resilience, new doubts enter every room in the Kremlin. How far would China go to protect its interests if the war drags on? How much economic pressure would it apply behind the scenes? How many strategic spaces would it quietly enter while Russia remains consumed by war? How much dignity is Moscow willing to trade for stability? And the danger is not only external, internal frustration can build when elites start seeing the same pattern. Hardliners may hate the idea of becoming China's junior partner. Business figures may resent the discounts and dependency. Security officials may worry about long-term erosion in the Far East and Arctic. Even if they do not challenge Putin openly, their view of reality changes. The myth of strategic independence becomes harder to sell. Once elite myths weaken, policy becomes more brittle. That brittleness matters because Russia still has cards: a huge nuclear arsenal, energy resources, geographic scale, diplomatic relationships outside the West, military capacity, even after losses. A country like that does not simply disappear into dependency. It resists, it improvises, it lashes out. And that is exactly what makes China's balancing act risky. You can squeeze a wounded bear for only so long before it turns unpredictably. Beijing likely knows this, but it may believe Moscow has no better option. Maybe that calculation is right. Maybe Putin swallows the insult, grows more dependent, and tells himself that survival matters more than pride. That is possible. In fact, it may be the most likely path in the short term. But history is full of leaders who endured humiliation until one final signal pushed them into reckless behavior. The deeper the dependence, the sharper the emotional backlash can become. And remember, this entire story sits on top of a war already driven by ego, fear, ambition, and control. Rational models help us understand the pieces. They do not fully predict the human reaction when those pieces cut into a leader's identity. Before we land this, do one small thing that helps a lot. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who wants the logic behind the headlines, not just the headline itself. So where does this leave Ukraine? In one sense, it offers a real advantage. If China is willing to help sustain critical civilian systems, even for its own reasons, that matters. War is not only about front lines, it is about endurance. Electricity, transport, repair capacity, civilian morale. When those hold, a country holds longer. If even a limited part of China's industrial weight is used to ease pressure on Ukraine's infrastructure, that complicates Russia's war strategy. It forces Moscow to confront the fact that destruction alone may not create the collapse it wants. But Ukraine also knows China is not a simple friend. Kyiv has every reason to welcome useful support while staying alert to Beijing's motives. China is not backing Ukraine's full war aims out of solidarity. It is pursuing leverage, image, and strategic flexibility. That means any help comes with limits. Any opening may close. Still, even limited help has power when it reveals a larger truth. Russia cannot fully control the behavior of the one major power it counted on most, and that truth travels far beyond Ukraine. It travels to Central Asia, where countries watch how Beijing and Moscow divide space. It travels to Europe, where policymakers measure whether China can be peeled away, even partially, from Russia's line. It travels to Washington, where strategists study how pressure on one rival affects the other. And it travels inside Russia, where the question is becoming harder to avoid. Has the war made Russia stronger, or merely lonelier and more dependent? That question may define the next phase of this entire conflict. Because the real shock is not that China can do business with Russia and still talk to Ukraine. Great powers often hedge. The real shock is that Beijing now appears comfortable showing that hedge in public. That comfort suggests confidence, and confidence suggests China believes the balance has shifted enough that Russia cannot meaningfully punish it. If that reading is correct, then the story here is not about one aid package, it is about the end of a comforting illusion. For years, the illusion was that Russia and China were marching side by side toward a new world order, each reinforcing the other, each protecting the other. But maybe they were never really walking side by side. Maybe China was slightly ahead the whole time, waiting for the moment when Russia's need became so great that the real ranking no longer had to stay hidden. That is the part that should keep the Kremlin awake, because wars do not only reveal military weakness, they reveal relationship truth. They show who pays a price, who profits, who waits, who speaks, and who gets spoken over. Ukraine has paid in blood. Europe has paid in fear and rearmament. The United States has paid in money and strategic attention. But China, in many ways, has tried to pay the least while collecting the most room to maneuver. That is why Beijing's move feels so cold. It did not choose one side cleanly. It chose leverage. And leverage is powerful because it works in silence before it works in headlines. You feel it in bargaining terms, in trade structures, in diplomatic tone, in who has to tolerate what. When China helps Ukraine and Russia absorbs it, the world learns something without a treaty ever being signed. It learns who can stretch and who must endure. So yes, Putin has reason to be alarmed. Not because China suddenly flipped camps in some dramatic movie twist. Not because tomorrow Beijing becomes Kyiv's protector, but because China may have shown the world that Russia's greatest partnership is now also Russia's greatest vulnerability. Think about how dark that is. The country Moscow leaned on to resist Western pressure may now be one of the main forces shaping how much pressure Moscow can bear. The partner presented as proof of Russia's independence may be the clearest evidence of its dependence, and the ally meant to strengthen Putin's hand may be using that hand to hold open doors for everyone else. And if you want the simplest version of this whole story, it is this. Putin may still control armies, borders, prisons, and propaganda, but control feels different when your most important external relationship is no longer built on trust, only on necessity. Necessity is unstable. It breeds resentment. It turns help into leverage and silence into humiliation. In the end, the most powerful part of China's move may not be what it gave Ukraine. It may be what it took from Russia. A little certainty, a little status, a little illusion. And sometimes that is enough to change the future, because betrayal in geopolitics does not always arrive with tanks. Sometimes it arrives with repair equipment, careful smiles, and a message no one has to say out loud. You are not my equal anymore, you are my option. And for a man like Putin, That may be the one sentence he can never afford to hear.